I tried all day, I swear to God, I tried all day to write an introduction in an obscure, ponderous, poetic form to honor the legacy of Eric's introductions, but I just couldn't do it. I really couldn't do it all day long. But to maintain the kind of faithfulness to his desire to use obscure art forms to make the audience squirm during the introduction, I've decided to do the entire introduction and summary or commentary in mime. So it worked, yeah. So I guess here, I'll do one mime thing for you and let you guess what it is. Where's Andrew?
They're very small gloves.
I know, I've been trying to get my fingers in them all day.
If they fit, you have to quit.
Hey, you want to do the damn introduction? Okay, let me see if I can get this thing. I can't find my thumb. I know, this is the mime. This is it. This is like living in one of Eric's buildings. Can you believe I can't get the damn glove on? Anyway, imagine these are on. Okay, and here's my one mime. God dog it. Goes like this. So guess what that is? That's not what you think it is, which is my reaction to his architecture. It's in fact what it feels like to the students and other faculty when he joins us on a review. Sorry. I should say that it's important to remember that this is the Raimund Abraham Lecture. It's the third of four, I believe. The first one was Stephen Hall, the second one was Tom Main, and Eric is the third. Raimund Abraham was a kindred spirit, mishpacha, we would have called him, and kind of member of the family, but sort of an embarrassing member of the family. And I was thinking, I went to the site of seeing new construction of Eric's today, and I was thinking about Raimund's architecture. Raimund had a deeply Platonic soul. I mean, he was a Platonic spirit, and his architecture really reflected that. And its precision and its everything about it was that. And you know, it seemed like that's kind of the opposite to Eric, I think. And on the way out to the site, you know, because you know there is a kind of informality or complexity to Eric's work. And on the way out to the site, I was thinking, you know, that I should speak to this. And I got to the site, and I used to think Eric's architecture was really like his introductions, really just intended to make the audience in the world squirm. But the more I've studied it, and I've started to study it more and more and more, and I thought I kind of knew it last time I lectured, and I feel like I've learned it more. I've discovered what I really believe to be a, I don't know what the word would be, a kind of thread of lyricism, even tenderness, actually, in the architecture. And so the one thing I'm going to ask you to do when you see the lecture tonight is to kind of look for it. But anyway, I got out to the site, and I don't even remember that. He'll show the project today. Actually, can I have this slide? And the minute I saw it, it looked like this. And I thought, you know, his use of structure and form, the kind of awkwardness is not as frightening or difficult as I thought. It's really quite tender. And I wonder whether you'll see the project or not. But look for this. In fact, look for this throughout the entire lecture. And I'm not joking, I think it's seriously there. So that's it, just take that off. As I was doing that, I was starting to think, how does Eric do that so well? I mean, I see a lot of projects that are quite complicated and stuff, but there's something about Eric's work, and it started to dawn on me, and particularly when I was on the site, that the amount of precision in his work is infinite. The number of calculations, whether in drawings or on the computer, the requirement for a kind of deep control in the work is absolutely necessary for it to not disappoint. And he has that, and I think you should look for it. So he pulls it off because of those calculations. And as you think about it, they're much greater than any Platonic architecture would ever require. You can get away in a sort of simplistic architecture like Richard Gluckman does with sort of faking the calculations. I don't think Raimund did that, but you can't get away with it in architecture. And so as you're watching the lecture, I'll ask you to watch for how that happens. And in fact, my favorite story is, I don't even know if you know the project. There's a project in Culver City that looks sort of like Spider-Man's head, and it's in brick. It's a small project. It was one of my favorites. But what I remember is him taking me to the office and showing me something like 75 working drawings to work out each brick. The number might be low. The quantity of effort he put into actually drawing the project so he would understand it before it was built was just manic. And I thought, why not just go out there and stick some bricks up and put some mortar, and while it's wet, move it around and stuff, which is kind of how I would have done it. So watch for that tonight. And then I guess I'm just going to end on thinking about the title a little bit. And the title of this lecture is "The Man from the Country Where No One Else Lives." And I couldn't help thinking, now I know Eric is going to start this lecture tonight with an obscure quote, so I wanted to do something on quotes. And I thought, well, that sounds like a Dan Quayle misquote of another title. Most of you aren't old enough to know Dan Quayle. But there are some things that it's sad that you missed in history, and there are some things that you should be relieved that you missed in history. His quotes are some of the funniest things in history, probably good that they're gone. So it sounded to me like he meant to say "no country for old men," but he kind of Dan Quayled it up. And so, Dan Quayle, if you remember, he said stuff like, in the vice president debate, he said, let me see if I can get this exactly right. Republicans understand that the importance of bondage between a mother and child. But even better than that, he said, he was speaking to the United Negroes College Fund, UNCF, and he stood up and he said, "I really love your motto. What a waste it is to lose one's mind." Now, for those of you who don't know, the actual motto is, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." So this is one of our great assets in Israel. But just to close, and this isn't a joke, a person died this week that really made me sad, and it was Hugo Chavez. And I don't know how you feel about him. He scared me, he threatened me. But I think he made the world a safer, more interesting place. I think he was good for the country. I think he was fantastic for South America. I really loved him. And it reminded me of Eric, and I thought there is one quote, that Dan Quayle is often made fun of, but I thought, again, that because of Chavez and Eric, that maybe we should think about it in a slightly different way. It's more serious than it deserves. And it goes like this. People that are very weird can occasionally get into sensitive positions and have a tremendous impact on history. Eric Moss.
Can you imagine I asked for that? My God. Hugo Chavez and Dan Quayle. No matter where he goes, we can't get the Ohio out of him. 3 years ago tonight, Raimund Abraham stood here and spoke to the SCI-Arc audience. And subsequently that evening, as you know, he found himself in an automobile accident and he didn't survive. And I miss him, and a number of you miss him, and a number of you miss the opportunity to miss him. But unlike the introducer, history isn't sentimental. History isn't sentimental. Raimund wasn't. He was a tough guy, an aggressive guy, a cantankerous guy, a take-no-prisoners guy. And I think more than that, if you, wait a minute, hang on. I know I left something out. If you spoke to him, hey Dick, if you spoke to him, you encountered what I think would be skeptical, cynical, pessimistic, angry, confrontational. So that was the tone in the voice for many years. disowned his family, disowned his country, disowned any number of schools, probably didn't disown the ideology of his architecture. But here's the point that I'd like to make, and I think it's useful for all of you who listen to these tough, aggressive, and sometimes pessimistic discussions. Underneath that is something substantially different, that the act of doing the work subsumes or transcends the architecture. So whatever the intellectual side or the pessimistic side or the cynical side, if it were literally true, if it were actually so, if that were his sensibility, he wouldn't do what he did. And in spite of the argument and in spite of the intellect, he made the project. He pursued the project over and over and over again. And I think in spite of what was often characterized as pessimism or cynicism, in fact, he was an optimist. And the spirit of the talk is in that spirit, optimistic. I have to confess that I can look out in the audience, I still don't know how to make a column. And I know some of you do, and we're still trying to learn. This is a recent example. And we know, I know, I won't find the answer in the utility of traditions, or the survival of old beliefs, or orthodoxy, or any of those allegiances or pedigreed ways of working and thinking about architecture. And I think if one takes that position, and I think sometimes that position is misunderstood, it's not, again, in the spirit of Raimund, in order to be obstinate or cantankerous or adversarial. It's simply a way of trying to see if there's a form language or a way to say what you're interested in trying to learn how to say and don't quite know. And to the extent Kipnis had something to contribute initially, I think the awkwardness of some of the pieces is a fair characterization, not awkward by intention, but awkward in an exploratory way, trying to learn how to make a column, among other things, roof, walls, floors, and windows, and so on. So this is a photograph I took long ago at Chandigarh. You recognize it? So, Secretariat, Assembly, High Court. Here's the point. We're very big, we're huge, and we're very, very tiny. Very big and very small. It's not one or the other, but it's the tension between the two that I'd like to communicate, and I think I'd like to communicate it to you and also to the work, that tension between possibilities. And if, referring to the last slide, you're prepared to reject the orthodox frame of reference, then almost inevitably that leaves one on one's own in an enormous venue where you're very small, or in a venue where you're actually quite large. So this is a story. I'm going to tell you 3 stories. Do you know the story of this Dürer, 15th century Dürer on the left? So you don't know. A few of you may know. But there must have been a time with a constituency for that image when almost everybody, whether you could read it or whether you couldn't, that is the biblical story. But you know the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. There are 4 horses. There's a red one, a black one, a white one. And in case you didn't study that part, so here are 3. And this is the pale horse. War, famine, pestilence, and death. but it's a narrative. It's a story, so the power of the image, the draftsmanship of Dürer is beyond dispute. But part of what adds to it and makes it substantial is that it's sitting on an apprehension, a narrative, a story that everyone shares. We have no story like that. We don't have their story. So when we do this, the story almost inevitably belongs to each one of us to invent. So if there are story or stories, they're plural. Image in the middle is the Roman cistern in a hole in the ground across the street from Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, built about 200 AD by the Romans. And there's another point here that I think is essential, as I understand how architecture moves, that it doesn't move incrementally, it doesn't move in an evolutionary way. It moves very often in an aggressive, forceful, cataclysmic way. So I'm going to make up a story about this as if I were an architecture historian. It probably is not true, but if it isn't, it could be true, and if it could be true, maybe it should be true. So these columns belong to a Greek temple that was built many years before. And the column base that you see was a column capital, and it's the Medusa. So you recognize the snake, so don't look too hard. So the Romans dismantled the temple, the Greek temple. They took it apart. They took the pieces, reconnoitered the pieces, brought them into the cistern, which is a big space underground, and used those pieces to reassemble something very different. So it had gone from a religious venue to a very utilitarian venue which collected water and distributed around the city. But the key point, I think, was they took the Medusa, which was sacrosanct in a religious way, in a mythological way for the Greeks, turned it upside down in one case, turned it sideways in another case, and dumped it into the water. So my reading of that is the Roman is sacrilege with respect to the Greeks. The Romans don't have their Aeschylus, they don't have their Phidias. Whatever the Roman world was and whatever its potency, it was very different than what the Greek world had. So this is an aggressive attack, in my view, on the content and the belief system of the Greeks, taking the Medusa, flipping it upside down, and drowning it. In spite of which, it's still, the residual consequences remain with us. The far image, the ubiquitous Don Quixote and his pal Sancho. So Sancho could be every man, could be everybody. And the Don could be everybody who is not everybody. And there's a choice here. And Sancho says, hey man, they're windmills. And the Don says, they're giants. They're giants. So who was right? Tell me who was right. And from my point of view, I think what's of interest about the image is the selection that Don Quixote made. So he said, they're giants. In my frame of reference, they're giants. That's what they are. That's the context in which I'll deal with them. So he decided, notwithstanding the pragmatist's view of what they were, they're giants. And they were giants. On the left, the hill of the Acropolis, 430. In the center, Sion, about 200 BC, and on the right, Nuremberg, probably 1938. And I wanted to make a point which is not so different than the previous point, having to do with architecture as political and as architecture one architect or one individual at a time versus architecture in a collective or crowd sense where the individual is entirely subsumed. And these are three very different versions of that topic. So at least as the story goes, one person at a time, maybe two, make your way up the hill of the Acropolis, an individual route, an individual's path, one individual at a time. Xi'an is a more complicated circumstance. These were characters, I think there are about 8,000 of them, who were buried with the emperor in order to accompany the emperor on the road to the afterlife. So it's collective and it's a group, but what's fascinating, if you look at the figures, the hair, the weaponry, the dress, the shoes, every single individual in that group of soldiers is entirely different from every other one. So somehow within a collective, there's a capacity to differentiate one individual from another. And finally, in Nuremberg, where the state and the space subsumes entirely the individual, and the individual becomes part of this collective. 2 days in the park. Y'all like parks. This is Seurat on the left and Claude Monet on the right, roughly at the same time. And the topic really is what constitutes radical? What constitutes radical? And in my view, there are two pieces to that discourse. The slide on the left is the bank of the Seine. Almost everybody wears the right stuff, sits in the right place, parades according to the proper pro forma, and so on and so on. So the operational content of the painting is extremely conservative. And what distinguishes it, what makes it different, or what makes it essential, or what makes it new, is the technique. So the subject matter, in a perceptual sense, who's doing what where, is very conservative, but the technique is a radical technique. And the opposite with Monet. This is just a conventional luncheon in a conventional park, in a conventional 19th century situation, luncheon in the park, except a couple of people took off their clothes. Just more of the same. So the content is now radical on the right, whereas the technique is radical on the left. I think you got to have both. There was a period of time when I used to collect maps over the years. And my dad at one point gave me a book, and the book traced the history of maps in countries. And I was fascinated, I recall this to this day, fascinated to see that names change, shapes of countries change, various configurations change, and so on and so on. And I think the need to make a map is one that we ought to pay some attention to. It's a need to set up a pro forma, or a pattern, or a method, or a system on which you can count, whether it's to get through the Okefenokee swamp, or to get to work, or to understand the interrelationship between the earth and the sky. And if you understand that, that gives you a context for saying, I'm like this, the neighborhood is like this, the city is like this, the country is like this, the world's like this, the sky is like this, and I can count on all those things. But what's fascinating is they keep making more, and it changes. The one on the right is roughly the same subject, a map of the sky done by the Apollo 16 astronauts. And I think one could say architecture is map making. Architecture is map making, with the caveat that you have to keep in mind you have to make another one. So this is the ideology of Mondrian on the left, straight line, right angle, black, white, gray, red, blue, yellow, pristine, the essence of things beneath the flux and the surface and the change. And my wife, Emily, gave me a book with these Broadway Boogie Woogie side by side a couple of years ago. And what fascinated me is this is the same painting, of course. So this is the print. This is actually the painting. And what happens is the surfaces aren't smooth, the lines don't meet, the tape falls off, all of that. So there is a question about whether the ideology of Mondrian is what Mondrian is, or the physical deteriorating reality is what Mondrian is. And when you go to the project on the right, I think what my interest was is not saying it's one or the other, but the truth is the tension, the truth actually, somebody used that word, that the truth is the tension between the two prospects, so that it's the box and not the box and not the box. I had a friend who was an artist, a writer, and he used to make lists of words. And when he wasn't writing poetry, he would make these lists. And I guess I wanted to share with you something that I don't normally share. This is my list of words. Studies that I've made over the past probably 15 or 20 years, but not so much as a single or singular, meaning both single and unusual point of view, but I would call it a didactic list, so that it contests itself and it has in it its own opposition. It's not a chronology, it's not a sequence, it's not a method, it's not a system, it's not an order, it's not a priority, and it's not an order and a priority. It's a sequence of pieces that are didactic, sketches, my list of words. Of course, they're scaleless and programless, and from a utilitarian point of view, purposeless. When you think about buildings that you do, all of you do, as discrete elements or projects, and you say, okay, here's the top, and here's the bottom, and here's the side, and here's the other side, and a building is an entity. And in thinking about that prospect, I had a somewhat different sense that it would be possible that either the buildings could be looked at not as buildings qua buildings or buildings as a totality, but just pieces. And that what mattered was only the pieces, one. And that secondly, if you made a summation of all of the pieces, it would never be the building. It would always be a piece of the building or the aggregate of all of the pieces to which you continue to add. So to turn the corner, I think one of the interests that we've had over the years is to combine, in a sense, Seurat and Manet, both in terms of content and in terms of making, to try to see if we can make what intrinsically we don't know how to yet make. This comes from the glass at the umbrella, and I recall a lot of the discussions. You can't draw it, you can't fabricate it, you can't engineer it, you can't pay for it, it'll leak, and they'll sue you. And I'm not going to tell you how many of those things happened, but more than one, and less than all, barely. And this is a, for instance, we were making an effort to fabricate the forms on which to slump the glass. And I just stuck up the Rhino model just to be clear, and I wanted to make this point. I think if we're talking about radical architecture, it for sure matters when it's done. When it's done. Because to make the glass today, when characters from Cricursa in Barcelona, from Shenzhen and from Mexico are coming to our office selling us the glass that we were told 10, 12 years ago couldn't be made, when there was no menu of choices, as you see on the right. And there's a series of efforts to make it, to bend it, to slump it, to obligate it, to force it, and inevitably this was actually done originally for Esapeka and Fleischmann for the LA Phil, and this was the poster they made at the time. This is John Cage in the middle. On the right are some of the organizational strategies for the space, which was the ubiquitous concert space. There is an interesting question. I don't know whether architecture can do this. It's often asked to, that somehow the design of the structure in architecture would carry the meaning of the building qua music. And having learned to bend the glass, this is a competition we won in New York, which was supposed to be the competition to either end all competitions or begin anew all competitions. And this is what was called the New York City building, which belongs to two World's Fairs, the Robert Moses era, some of you know, off the Van Wyck and the Grand Central Parkway. And in a way, talking about what we know or what we might not know. So it's probably fair to say this represents what we know or think we know about the meaning of building. And this represents a more quizzical approach. And just to put this in some frame of reference, the building actually had a very special pedigree. It was used for the UN, by the UN General Assembly while the UN building on the river was being built. And in it, at the time from 1946 to 1950, which is when they used the building to meet, and they met here, Korea was partitioned, Korea was partitioned, Palestine was partitioned, so it carried with it a very particular history. And in remaking this and remaking that quizzical central space, the world we don't know as opposed to the world we do, we moved that venue into here and transformed it into a discussion of gallery and assembly and so on and so on. And finally, there is an association in the project, both of the Carpenter Center that you all know and love and the way through, I can't remember the streets, I think Prescott Street to Quincy Street. But the idea is if you're on the way to English, we'll drag you through the arts building. And you can look at media and you can look at painting and you can look at sculpture and so on. We'll pull you through there. And a similar strategy by Jim Sterling at the Staatsgalerie. You live up here and the bus is down here, and they drag you through that museum in Stuttgart. And we proposed a similar organization, which we called Art on the Way to the Zoo, as an organizational strategy for the project. This was another one that we won 2006, 7. For those of you who know the MCI Center in Washington, D.C., this is called a patent office building, where for many years they saved the models and the drawings of the ubiquitous Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, and so on. In the brief for the project, they of course asked that the building would live up to that pedigree of American invention. So we proposed this project, which is essentially a roof, this being the existing Smithsonian Museum that dates from the 19th century, and this being an open courtyard, which Sir Norman has since covered, similar to the British Museum, same scheme. So the idea was essentially to make a roof over the space and create what they called at the time, nobody should laugh, democracy's room. So we were making democracy's room, and which is roughly 110 meters long, about 30 meters wide, and came back to this is Seurat in a slightly different visage, with the issue of points, and developed a series of glass tubes, laminated glass tubes about 1 meter in diameter, anywhere from 4 to 8 meters long. And the way we worked on this was to presume 2 areas for meeting and gathering, which the program actually prescribed, one lengthwise and one in the opposite direction. And those 2 points are those 2 points. And then essentially to make the typography, which is a hybrid, which you wouldn't do in Carnegie Hall or the Mariinksy, but is a hybridization of 2 concert halls in one, and then to make that roof as a hybridization of surfaces now as points. This, I think, was done. I think this was done for a Biennale later, but it gives you an idea of the roof structure. And part of the adventure of the glass had to do with this. We installed a series of columns and Varendale trusses, and then you can see a cable here, there's a tube here. So the glass functions structurally, and when we marched into that room with the Arab guys from London and New York and so on, making the case, there was some skepticism that glass could function in compression in that way. So there is a truss spanning from here to here, it's that, and the glass cylinders, which don't end there but extend beyond and do other things, auditory, acoustic, lighting, and so on. And that's what we did to make that roof surface. And then it turns out that there's another opportunity to do something by analogy, and we're on our way to building that one in Los Angeles. This is a very special adventure for me and those who join me. This is the Neva River in St. Petersburg, which became Leningrad and then became St. Petersburg again. And the Russian winter, if you haven't met it, is not like put a coat on, it's raining. It's a way of thinking and living and breathing, and the cold is the rule and a little sunshine is the exception. And what's also remarkable is the ice breaking and freezing on the Neva River. And we came to this, we won a couple of competitions in St. Petersburg, 2002, 2003. This is Malevich's New Man, in case you, Lizitsky's is more famous. but also more predisposed to select the kind of architectural solution. So this is Malevich and the new man. The reason I put it up, the project is still in discussion. They actually built the building the other day, and they're still calling and talking and speculating. And I think what I wanted to say was that for me, the transition from Gorbachev to Yeltsin and the optimism, back to Raimund, the optimism that we carried about what you could do in Russia and a new Russia, which is not so different than Russia almost 100 years before. And whether we made the same mistake twice or the world made the same mistake twice, we could speculate. So we went into this project thinking we could change the discourse. And this is for the Mariinksy, which you know is the Kirov, which just for an architect to work with such an extraordinary, talented group of people. I mean, if the sun would shine, they can do it on the street corner. Remarkable, talented, inventive, run by a character by the name of Valery Gergiev, who from time to time brings his troupe to America and to LA. If you get a chance, you should see them. So this was the first scheme that we proposed for the competition. And there's an unusual English language newspaper, which is obviously the only one I could read in Russia, called Kommersant, and they immediately named the two solutions, the iceberg and the ice cube, for obvious reasons. So this was 2002, 2003. So this is the winning solution for the Mariinksy. This being the original Mariinksy, there's a canal that runs through here, and this was our solution. And just to acquaint you a little bit, so this is the frozen river you were looking at. There's a canal that runs through here. This is the Mariinksy site. This is what's called New Holland. That's New Holland over there. That's the Mariinksy over there. So this is very quickly the siting context. So this was the second solution on the left for the Mariinksy, and then New Holland on the right. A series of studies. We had a lot of discussion about the role of glass and the role of glass in the interior. This is the beginning of wrapping that area with glass, and then the seating, and then the enclosure, and then the complete project. There was a series of clay models that we made. There are interesting questions for another discussion about symmetry and asymmetry in those circumstances. And this is an acoustic model which actually has to be run slowly, but was helpful to us in making the glass as operationally intelligible case. So what's this? This is a little bit what the hell is it quotient. And we became interested in the use of fiberglass on site as a finished material. It's a wet material, so it allows you to complete any number of unusual configurations with a number of engineering and technical caveats. So this is a study that we made in the office looking at the material, the color of the material, the bonding of the material, and so on and so on. So like the study for the forms of the glass, this is very much part of our operation, and I think insistence on understanding how it will be implemented, or at least how it might have a chance to be implemented. This is a project done for a company called the Tennis Channel, which began here added a sound studio here, added a series of offices here, and we're working on the last piece of offices now. And this is, of course, I said, pay attention to when these things happen. It actually matters. And this is a different argument because this is a drawing, a number of these were made. Rhino model sent to somebody in Vancouver who makes every beam and every stick, and everyone is different. And they did that, and we did that, and were able to build the project. Which now houses Comedy Central and the Young Turks. Maybe they do a little tennis too, from time to time. In the late 90s, we were asked by the Wexner to participate in an exhibition in the Wexner building in Columbus, Ohio. I can't remember who the architect was for that project. Maybe somebody can remember. But it's also interesting what precipitates content or ideas, and whether it comes from you as a part of a list, as in the writer's list, or whether it's provoked as a response to a particular assignment. And I think in this case, the Wexner is beholden, and beholden may not be the right term, but it certainly belongs to a discourse on the grid. So in the usual discourse of the origins of grids, nobody can verify any of this. So this is Hippodamus at Miletus in an early Greek grid, which somehow is the antecedent or the pedigree for the Wexner, which bends the grid, folds the grid. It probably doesn't microwave the grid, but whatever it can do to the grid, it aspires to do. In theory, the grid doesn't entertain the prospect of a center. So antithetical to the grid line might be the curved line. So we began to look at a pro forma that would understand a different amalgamation of lines. This was a drawing, this was the installation in the Wexner, and out of sequence, this is an installation we made in Austria, which was not so much to disown Hippodamus, but to obviate Hippodamus. So this is at the MAK in Vienna. But earlier, in about 2000, 2001, 2002, we were asked to do this high-rise project, which originated as two and went away actually for a time and has since become one. The siting, this is the concretized LA River, in case you don't recognize it. So we began to work on that in 2001, 2002. And the hypothesis in terms of commercial real estate was that this wasn't a high-rise building at all, but was simply a stacking of a variety of single-story buildings at very different heights. So in making this building, there's a 13.6 height and a 16.6 height and a 24-foot height, and the 24-foot height accommodates a mezzanine, and we're now drawing this. So it's come back to life. And this is the Katia, a piece of that development. So the organizational geometry is here. I mean, there's a very separate question about the hypothesis of curved lines as obligatory, and then the adjustment of those lines in order to accommodate a whole series of pragmatic questions. And you have to be able to tell me which of these lines belong to the origin and which belong to the obligations of adjustments, or if you don't make it, the building falls down. And there are no columns in the building, so this structure supports everything. And this is current study model of the project. And the interiors. We did do a proposal. I was arguing with the guy who writes for the Times. I can't remember his name either. The other day about this and about urbanism and rivers and airports and so on. And I think what was of interest about this project was it wasn't let's make the airport it's the point of entry, or the train station, or let's fix the river. It's different because it isn't anything at all, this project. It's nothing at all unless the makers of the project make it so. So it's not a priori, oh, it's the airport. A priori, oh, it's the river. So it is what it is because of whatever it comes to be in the hands of the people who make it, but it has no particular a priori value. Anyway, this is the expo line which brought all of this to life. This is the tower we're building. This is another project that we did for Cineon Kodak a few years ago. This is, I guess, what's considered central, south central Los Angeles. This is one of the few buildings that actually has been built over there. And then there was a cyclotron and a whole series of pieces in here, medical components that we proposed. The development of the corner of Jefferson, and this is La Cienega. And then a garage that the expo people were putting up. And said, let's put a garage here. That confirms the urban program of the city of Los Angeles. Please give us a garage. And we said, that's not plausible. Let's add a few things to the garage. And we did make a case with Antonio and Jan and Gail, who subsequently resigned, and I think said to me at one point, why are the train engineers making the city? So we did make an effort. I think it's fair to say it's ongoing to change the context of La Cienega and Jefferson and to identify that as an essential crossroads in the city of Los Angeles. On the left, again, would be something that one would have to say is nondescript. It's a warehouse building that belongs probably to the 1940s and 1950s with a bowstring truss and an industrial press. And we had a scheme. This is a scheme from 1992, and this is a piece of a scheme from 2002. So on and off over quite a long period of time, we've worked on this site and ultimately preserved this building, rehabilitated it, stripped the tower for all of the Sierra Clubbers in the audience, retained the tower, the industrial press, turned it into a meeting area, so it is a meeting area, gathering area, with a garden overhead, and utilized conceptually the structural model that we proposed in the Smithsonian Institute for the pots. So the pots are pots, qua pots, they hold cacti, and they also function in compression as part of a truss. And then here, the second tower, although my understanding, here's the drawing of the pots, and you can see the way we did this, that the cuts in the pots are different from end to end so that the cable runs through. The pots are in compression, so these in the end are a series of trusses which also happen to hold the cacti. And then the building in the front, and I think I have to say the two go together. They're two towers, they're the same height, they're the same dimension in plan. This is a conference center, which we're building now, and this was the original model. And then the curve reappears as vertical and horizontal lines on the surface of the building. And as the curve intensifies, the frequency of the brise-soleil elements does the same. So again, the curve is made with straight lines, and then in between, it will be glazed, which is always a nice day. And we start to build it. This is a useful image to me because it's always my sense that it's not democracy in the sense that I like this and hate this, or I pick this over this, but the truth of the matter is the tension between two plausible prospects, or maybe implausible prospects. There have been a number of projects we've been involved in. I think this is an old topic about, it's not only that you scrape the sky as an aspiration, but you also etch the soil. This was an early model for the Queen's competition, and this is the beginning of the art tower, which is actually excavated a floor and a half below grade on the corner of Hayden and National Boulevard. Under construction and various vantage points. And you can see here going down into the ground, there's a small theater on both sides, and then the screens that you've heard discussed on a number of occasions. And speaking of scratching the ground and touching the sky, maybe this is a subject like flying, you know, that the aspiration to make that kind of object that connects the land and the sky is a kind of dream very old, whether it's biblical or Brancusi's or Max Bill's. And that an architect has to, I think, be a part of that discourse in one form or another. There are a couple of projects now that are ongoing, and I think both came out of the Art Tower project. One came through Tsinghua University is here, and as you can start to see, this is in Weihai, and the Chinese have decided to entirely remake the intersection of the land and the sea. They're building a city, and the icon for the city is this tower in Weihai, and maybe you can follow the sequence. I mean, in terms of the way I've presented sequences and chronologies and systems and methods, I mean, I would probably have to disown this, but the logic of that is simply there to make a conventional kind of exegesis available. So it's the tower, and this is the plan, and then the tower evolves or enlarges in response to the hill. The hill is developed as a museum, and so on and so on. The structural mesh or cable net, the elevators, the braces, the restaurants, and so on. It's not a tower that's filled with space. It's a tower that sets up positions in space very high up and becomes the icon for the city of Weihai. And there's another one in Taichung that we were asked to take a look at, which is not dissimilar. Again, a discourse on the land and the remaking of the land with a series of points where from all around the perimeter one can enter, and then stairs and elevators. Actually is a museum, an urban museum here, a theater, and then small pieces of office and restaurant, so on, in going up. And this will be the museum. See points of entry here. The theater is in this space, and then looking up from the theater up through the net. I like this story because the notion, I think, didn't come as an evolved concept worked on over a number of years. Somehow, for reasons that I don't think I can quite account for, it landed, and among the places it landed was the consequence of an invitation to do a project in Almaty in Kazakhstan a few years ago. So this is nominally the slinky or the spiral as a structural idea. This is when we used it for the Biennale, and you can see what's happened to the pieces, what began as a pipe and then evolves as a consequence of a series of bracing or structural operations. So this was a mock-up, and then the delivery in Venice of the project. And this I think actually preceded the Venice proposal. This is called Republic Square, and this is a project that we submitted and presented in Kazakhstan, which is an amalgamation of various uses with a public space in a public square. It's a very large city, actually, a relatively large city of 1.5 million, the biggest city in Kazakhstan. And the building has office and hotels and housing and entertainment and so on and so on. And the intersection or the making, again, it's not one, but it's the insistence that these disparate pieces actually become obligated to one another. So roughly speaking, this is the program, and roughly speaking, this is the spiral. And operationally, there are a series of cuts made. These have to do with lights and cable nets, letting light into the interior of the building. And then by turns, the two essential elements are obligated to one another as the spiral meets the program. And there are a series of elements that are strung through the large public space on the ground, which is what you see in the model. And that space would be, this space went down to a garage underneath, and those are those elements and the model. Trying to figure out why we stuck this in, but I think there's a message somewhere. This is a proposal we were asked to do for a high-rise in Clerkenwell in London, I think in '98. And it's sideways. So it had to do with borrowings probably from the sketches or the word list that I showed you a few minutes ago. And I was looking at this the other day, so this piece and this piece, and finally thought maybe this piece was worth mentioning, only in the sense that there's some apprehension that one returns almost inevitably to notions that are of interest and of concern, as opposed to putting those behind you and going ahead. I guess there's a way of looking at it that says, we have no enemies. That probably would be the current architecture profession. Or another way to look at it would be, everybody is my enemy. Another way to look at it. And probably the third way is, the enemy is me. In other words, the person I have to keep my eye on in terms, in this case, of the tendency to replicate, duplicate, redundancy is me. So that's the origin of we have met the enemy. I did want to say a word or two about the opportunity to make a city or a piece of a city in central Los Angeles and Culver City. And I put up for you, I think, 3 stages. It's probably not this discrete, but this is a very long time ago, maybe yesterday. The city as instinct. The city as instinct, meaning the method, the pro forma, the pattern, the system, the rule, is something you're fumbling with or investigating. So nobody has yet set out the rules and regulations, and you move to this, and you can see, you have to tell me whether this came first or this came first, but you can tell me later. But the point here is that this evolves now into a more predictable pattern of solutions, rules, precedents, regulations, and then ends in redundancy with no discourse at all. And it may be, in fact, the truth of the matter is that all 3 of those occur simultaneously. These are a series, part of a long series of very early computer drawings. I think in the early 90s when we first started to work in the Culver City area, which includes really 3, or that Culver South Central area, which includes this venue and this venue, where, by the way, we proposed, this was a park actually, about an 800-meter long park crossing the river, and then this portion, which is South Central Los Angeles. So 3 of those venues. This was actually the study of that right-of-way, which was a park and many other things. And this was the piece that we proposed. There was a lot of discussion about this. This is, again, the LA River, and the crossing of the LA River, this was done in about 95, the crossing of the LA River from Culver City to Los Angeles to the project that we were doing at that time for Cineon Kodak. These are 100 years apart, actually, but emotively, maybe they're close. And this is the Stealth project that belongs to 97, 98, about 110 meters long. The hypothesis being that as you move through the building, you continuously move through space which is in perpetuity different, going from east to west. And then this is a project, and I have to say, I don't know whether I say this with pride or frustration or optimism, but this project, we built the garage. As some of you know, there are about 1,000 cars in that garage. And we are now, after about 11 years, with a little help from CATIA, and I actually sent Patrick a note, notwithstanding all of the debates, and acknowledging that without that technical capacity, it would have been impossible to deliver this. So we're building, we're not on the site yet, but we will be in a few weeks of finally building that project, which is for us extremely exciting. So this was the program, originally 9 blocks, as you can see, and then the height limit intervenes. And the rear setback intervenes. And whatever is left on the front that allows you to hang over the garage and still get your car in. That's the second floor, which actually does have a little bit of square footage now. We made some adjustments. So the ground floor, that's the elevator core. It brings you up on the elevator into the building. The ground floor is entirely open, and there are a series of mezzanines that make the second floor. So there it is, and it's about to go under construction. Siegfried Gideon told a story, I think. Again, if he didn't, maybe he should have. And it has to do with what architecture is over time. And he described it, he used the metaphor of the river. So architecture is a river running from here to here, running from behind you to in front of you. Architecture is a river. And what every architect does is to drop his or her offering into the river, and it goes, and it floats, or it sinks, or I guess there's another possibility which it might sink and float. I think Raimund did that for us, and I think he made his offering, and I think interestingly enough it's up to it's up to us and up to you to decide what sinks and what floats as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Frankly, just as Eric didn't need an introduction, he really doesn't need commentary. But I'm going to just make a couple of remarks. I adored him as a person. I really have come to love his architecture. To have his architecture work for you requires that you read it like you read Pynchon or Melville or David Foster Wallace. You go to it, you read it, you think you understand it, you leave, you live a little bit, you go back to it, you read it again, you realize you missed it completely, you go out, you live a little bit. It's a fantastic experience, and I am thrilled about it. I've seen all these projects, I've seen him lecture many times, but it's like I don't know, it's like a fantastic piece of music. I love to hear it over and over again. It was really, I hope you think it was as good a lecture as I do. But more than anything else, I deeply envy how he thinks. So more than love, I am amazed at and admire his way of thinking, and I just want to speak to it for a few issues for a moment. Just today I was listening to Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican author on NPR who recently died, speaking about how his creative life began, which had to do with the fact that he was 16, he was the son of a diplomat, and he would travel the world, and he had a kind of idealized view of Mexico, and then when he moved to Mexico at 16, he discovered the reality of Mexico, that it wasn't a perfect world, and that his creative life came out of the tension between those two, and that tension had to do with, and it wasn't about resolving the tension, but about embracing the tension. And what he said, what I thought was so interesting, was that optimism, that his goal in his writing was always to find an authentic optimism, and that authentic optimism comes out of critical tension. And it's optimism, if you can only be critical of your context, and jingoists and chauvinists are not optimists, cheerleaders, but you can only be critical of the context if you're optimistic about the fact that it can respond to that criticism. And I think that's absolutely the core of the talk that we saw today, and I wanted to remind you about that. I was incredibly moved at how well Philip Glass confirmed my idea that there was a deep lyricism and tenderness in the work, and I hope you saw that as well. And I thought that got proven at the very end when, what's the pianist's name? Blind piano. Ray Charles's ringtone. We got to hear that with the Pterodactyl, and it didn't quite work as well. So I thought it was kind of fun. The idea of the relationship between the individual and collective, I think, is probably the most important topic that he raises as a goal for architecture. And I have a slightly different take on that, but I think we share that an idea that architecture's deepest gift that it can give to our day-to-day life is not directly responding to the context or solving problems, and all of those things are really important that we do those. But more and more than that, staging a proliferation of existential niches so that more and more people in the world feel like that there's a place for them in the world and that they feel at home in the world. And so that when I'm walking around Princeton University, or when I'm walking around aspects of parts of LA, I mean, it's really beautiful. I can't tell you I don't admire, but I certainly don't feel at home there. I certainly feel like it's not about what I'm about. And so when I see Eric's architecture, it makes me feel welcome and as if the world honors my existence. And I think that's a really important achievement in architecture, and perhaps the most important achievement of all in architecture. And I'm proud of the fact that this school is so dedicated to that project. I guess the last thing I want to close on, this is for the students, because one of the most brilliant moments in the talk, I thought, was when he was comparing Manet to Seurat. And it was a point where he was talking about one as an invention in technique and the other one as an invention in subject matter. But I think the backstories of both of those are really interesting. The backstory of Seurat is, Seurat was a post-impressionist, and he actually wanted to paint his paintings in a more scientific manner. He wanted to study vision, he wanted to learn how paintings were seen, and then he wanted to paint paintings according to the theory of vision. And so he read the most current theories of vision of his day and mastered them, or thought he mastered them. He developed his pointillist technique, and it turned out that not only was the theory that he read wrong, but his reading of the theory was incorrect. Now, theorists of the day, today, like me, would hope that his incorrect reading might accidentally have stumbled on the correct theory, but in fact that wasn't the case. So there is no correlation, I think, between trying to know what you're doing and doing what you do in terms of the discipline. And so I think it's a great lesson for students. But more interesting to me, Manet was obsessed with the paintings of Velázquez. Velázquez probably had the greatest spontaneous technique in the history of painting. He was able to do things like paint 1,000 pages on the side of a book with 3 brushstrokes, or paint 80,000 hairs with a minimum number of brushstrokes. And so he had these fantastic tricks that no one could ever figure out. And Manet studied and studied and studied and studied and tried to copy those tricks forever. And when he finally realized he couldn't master those techniques is when he started to introduce subject matter and critical commentary into the world of art. It was as if in his failure to be a painter, he felt like his only hope was to keep his chance of being a painter alive, to make paintings mean different things. And so the Déjeuner sous l'herbe, the painting you saw of him, interestingly enough, is a quote from, I think, if I can't remember, but I think it was Titian. So it takes an original painting, he puts the nude coquette in it, she reappears in Olympia, and all of a sudden painting becomes a form of critical commentary and therefore reaffirms the optimism that I think we started with. So I think those were super great moments for me. I really loved it, and I hope you did as well. And in the spirit of criticism, he'll be here to answer your questions, and thank you very much. Good night.